Welcome to the System Simplified podcast, where we feature top leaders who share stories on how to successfully systemize a business. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, Adi Klevit here with the System Simplified podcast, where we interview top entrepreneurs, founders, and thought leaders about systematizing a business. And this podcast is being brought to you by Business Success Consulting Group. At Business Success Consulting Group, we create custom processes and tailor-made business systems so businesses can thrive and grow. All right, and today's guest is Mark Miller. Mark, hello.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being a guest on this podcast. I'm really excited to have you here because we're going to talk about systems. And per your own words, you were an anti-process person. Now you became a so pro-process person.
Yeah, I'm very pro-process now.
So we're going to talk all about processes. And you are the co-founder and president of Historic.
Yes. Yeah, we're a brand strategy and design thinking group out of Phoenix.
Excellent. But you do service clients all over the US.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So we most of our clients actually are not from Arizona. They're all over the country. So
fantastic. So before we start diving into processes, tell us a little bit about Historic. How did it get started, and who's your ideal client?
Yeah. So Historic got started with me and a few friends, kind of a side hustle, if you will. I had been in-house with a technology company in Atlanta, but I lived in Phoenix, so I was commuting every week, which was a challenge to try to have a family when you're gone for 5 days every week. And we grew that company from 9 million to close to 20 million. It got sold to a private equity company, and decided at that time like it was probably time to start a family and maybe find a job closer to home. So I started Historic out of that while picking up a day job in a nonprofit, and fell in love with working with nonprofits and the mission and cause. And Historic was kind of going in the background. And one day I woke up and we had hired 4 full-time W-2 employees within, I think, 2 years. And I was like, oh, maybe I should go work for my own company now that it is starting to have employees with no managers. And so I transitioned out of the nonprofit I was at. They became a client of ours, and everything just kind of took off. And so we focus primarily on nonprofits or kind of cause-oriented businesses, which I hate saying because a lot of people say that. But the thing that makes us unique is not just our strategy-first approach, but is that we have a lot of expertise in communicating to two very different audiences. And these aren't like consumer audiences where audience A buys product A for a reason, and audience B buys product B for a reason. They may buy product A for a different reason. But these are two audiences, one that has no reason, but other than legacy and mission and heart to give. And then that organization serves a completely different audience, right? It's not even the way they message is night and day. And so we're really great at that work. And we're a design thinking organization. And so we help the nonprofits become more effective through design thinking. And that could be brand strategy, culture, all the way down to what their website looks like. So we run the gamut of the services, but through the lens of design thinking and strategy first.
Love that. Great. So, we talked a little bit before the podcast, and you told me a great story about what happened during the pandemic. And we talk about the word pivot. Obviously, it's probably the most used word during the pandemic, but you took it to a whole different level because it really got you to ask questions, and you're going to, I'd love for you to share that question that you ask of yourself, your team, in order to figure out, really question the way you're doing things and how to improve and what was the outcome of it. So I'd love to hear that story.
So during COVID, just like most organizations, we didn't know what the future held. We lost 30 to 40% of our annual revenue in 2 weeks. So we had a lot of retainers that were booked for the year, all of them canceling, executing their exit clauses, even though they hadn't paid money, and they were everything was just gone. And so we had to start looking at making decisions, we decided to kind of restructure. We brought in some high level CFO help that was outsourced to help us manage and understand finance and get some data that we couldn't get in house. We're a boutique agency, so we didn't have probably the manpower in that area that we needed as a growing organization. And so we got some new data, and that new data was pointing to things that we thought were working but weren't actually working, right? And so if you don't have a good process, right, you don't necessarily know what is profitable, what isn't profitable, what is working, what's not working, how clients interact with things. You could be thinking it from an emotional standpoint, like, oh, that project went really well, so it was great, and we charged a lot of money. But they could be actually the opposite, right? That from a financial standpoint, it did really poorly. So what we noticed was, as a brand strategy firm, that our logo design process was burning cash. Like, it would take us way more money than a client was paying us to design a logo. And you think that wouldn't be the case, given that's kind of a core competency of a brand strategy firm, is to ultimately design the logo in addition to the messaging and positioning and all that. So we were getting really frustrated of like trying to figure out new ways. We would do what typical agencies would do, is we'll spend some time doing discovery with the clients and research, and then the design and creative team in-house will come up with ideas and sketches, develop those things into concepts, present those concepts, the client reviews those, and then kind of they give us feedback and we make changes or whatever. And just that cycle repeats itself for weeks, if not months. And it was just taking way too long. And we got so frustrated that our creative director was just like, he threw his hands down and he was like, said the F word, and was like, why can't we just, blank? Like, why can't we just design the logo in front of the client? And he was like, he was so frustrated. And then he was like, serious, like, why can't we? And I was like, well, agencies really don't do that. And then I was thinking, why do they don't do that? And then I realized, well, I think we might not do that because we don't want people to show, we don't want to show our work that we're afraid of the client picking bad work, right? That this was a mistake and we're trying things and we don't want to be vulnerable with the client. We kind of want to hold this secret keys to creativity. And then when I started digging into it, it seems like it's more rooted in our perceptions about ourselves than it is our relationship with the client. And so we were like, well, if we were to do it, if we were to design a logo in front of a client in real time, what would that look like? And we're like, I don't know. Let's try it. And so we experimented with a bunch of different things and ultimately came up with a very detailed process that allows us to bring the client into the creative process by doing participating in the ideation phase and sketching things and doing things. Obviously, they don't end up designing the logo, we do, but they have way more ownership, and we build so much trust in that front end ideation process that, and we're all vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable with their ideas that are really bad, which most of them are because they're not designers, and then we're vulnerable with our good ideas and bad ideas. That it allows us to have a completely different relationship with the client during the design phase. And what is remarkable is that, and we do this in a few different ways depending on the scope and scale of the project. But what is amazing is the client gets so excited about the logo because they were participating in it. And if you've ever pitched the logo or a new brand, what you find sometimes is people don't have the emotional attachment to that new brand as they did the old one. And so it's hard for them to go take it to other external, internal stakeholders or external stakeholders and get buy-in. It's hard for them to sell it themselves because they don't have the emotional equity that we do, that we've spent all these hours, designing stuff and throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what works. And so by including them in that process, they just have time and time again have been on fire to immediately use it and sell it. And they sell it better than we do sometimes to internal stakeholders because they're so excited. And the thing that was remarkable was it wasn't like you could just design a logo in front of a client. There's so many things that can go wrong that we found out by experimenting, that you actually need really detailed process and there are a bunch of different steps. And so there's actually way more documented process and more steps to our logo process now, even though we've condensed it down anywhere from a 3-day or 2-day sprint to multiple 3-day sprints, depending on the scale of the project, where it used to take us months, right? And even though it took us months.
I think here, let me stop you for a second, because I think you're saying so many things that are so important. And, and obviously not all of our listeners are agency owners, they don't design logo, but the example of what you just did is so important that can be used for any business, right? So the main thing is, you identified a problem.
Right.
And then you identified a problem. In this case, it was a process that is needed, part of your main processes or main things that you need to do in your agency, but it was not profitable, right? So you asked the question, somebody came up with a bright idea to resolve it. And the question is, what's the question that you asked?
So the question that has become part of our culture is, why can't we just blank? So if you ever get frustrated about a problem and you ask that question, why can't we just blank? Whatever that answer is, well, why can't we just do it this way?
Then and if there is no good reason, or if the reason is like, because that's not the way it's been done around here, or this is the way it's always been done. That's my thing. It's like when people say, this is the way it always has been done. We're like, oh, okay. So we really need to.
That's a red flag.
That's a red flag. But why can't we do blank? And then really dig in there. Like, don't accept an answer that does not make sense to you, right? So
start asking more questions.
Ask more questions. So I think that is the key thing of like what you're saying is like, you identify an issue, but then you start digging into that issue. I mean, identify an issue, come up with a bright idea. Why can't we do that bright idea? Why can't we do a different way? And if there is like the stop is yourself, or a preconceived idea, or some kind of a thing that has been there for a long time, then you have to challenge it. So it's really about challenging. And then in order to actually create or implement that bright idea or that change, you do need to have a system, a very well defined system, so you can move on those steps and actually be able to complete it, to do it. So it's thinking outside the box, but thinking outside the box in an organized way, right?
Right. Yeah. And so that has become a prompt, right? Asking that question. And sometimes you might come up with this bright idea, right? To fill in that blank, why can't we just whatever? And then it doesn't work, but we still want to test that theory, right? Because if we don't develop that muscle of challenging the conventional thinking, we're always going to end up doing the things the way they were done. And sometimes that's good, right? And sometimes it's bad. But in every time when we find an opportunity on the other side of that question is, okay, we need to define a process that lets us do something really radical. So that's kind of what we learned during the pandemic.
I love it. So what would you say, you said when we talked before, you said you used to be anti-process, which I find it a lot with creative people, right? I mean, process, no, I just want to create, right?
Yeah, right.
But then you go, okay, after actually being the business owner and entrepreneur and looking at profitability and looking at what works, what doesn't work. Why would you say, if I ask you, Mark, why processes are so important in a business? What would you say?
Oh man, there are so many different ways or so many different reasons that our processes are so important. As a young creative person who was really I could figure things out. It seemed to me like, why can't everyone else just do it the way I do? We don't need process, just figure it out. Like this, that's fine. But it turns out not everyone is wired the same way. And so one reason I would say process is really important is diversity of your team. So if you want creative ideas, if you want better execution, if you want a better culture, better ideas that lead to more profitability, more customers, you need a diversity of ideas, which requires a diversity of people. And there's a diversity of people means not everyone's going to operate the same way. And so process allows you to operate at the same standard, regardless of personality and in some cases skill. And people don't really look at it that way, right? Usually people say, well, process will help us save time, which saves money. But really, it allows you to have a more diverse team, which brings in better ideas. And so that's one area. Obviously, efficiency is a huge deal, right? I'm sure you and your organization talk about how process can save you time and money. And so as an owner, once I became responsible for making payroll every 2 weeks, you're like, oh no, like how do I do these things? And I need to be able to do them at a high level of quality and expertise. And so process fills that gap. And then as a creative person, I would also say that, and just a human who wants to have joy in their work, process, when designed appropriately, allows people to do what they're good at, right? A lot of times where process goes wrong is process is designed for someone in accounting, right? But the process is actually for someone else in a different department doing something else. But because accounting needs this information, we're going to design the process for accounting and not for the person doing the work, right? And doesn't serve the organization, doesn't serve the brand, it doesn't serve the desired outcomes. It serves another master. And so if you can develop and design a process that serves people, so we have a phrase that we want all our process and systems to be people-centered, that they serve the people. People don't serve process and systems. Then you get so much more out of your team. They are able to do better work. They're able to bring their whole selves. There's not this bureaucracy or red tape. And again, counterintuitively, to design systems and process that is people-centered requires actually more detail and more effort in designing those process and systems than what you would think, right? So, as a young person who is like, oh, I can figure stuff out. Why can't everyone else figure out? We don't need process. Like, we'll just make things. It sounds like a good in theory. But then when you start digging into it, right? Like even in our creative process, and this is, obviously not everyone is doing creative work, but there are times where we get stuck. And so we could just stare at a blank wall until we get unstuck and more ideas pop into our head, or we can develop a process that forces us to get unstuck and to think differently. And,
I love that. So what would be an example of that? Because that, it's not everybody's maybe is creative in terms of the marketing, but it's definitely something that it got, because,
everyone gets stuck sometime.
Yeah, you get stuck at whatever, oh, I don't want to do this task right now. I'll put it aside and then you never come back to it, etc. So what would be an example of a process that you develop to unstick?
Yeah. So, in our organization, on the creative side, we have different steps that force us to think differently about something. So when we're looking at a project, and we can't come up with ideas, we'll force ourselves to ask a series of questions about that, or we'll go and create we call them categories, but different ways of looking at this. So like, even though we're supposed to, like, say, design a website and we're stuck on something, well, what if we took the brand, instead of designing a website, we designed a toaster and asked that question? And you're like, well, the toaster has nothing to do with it. But what it does is it forces your brain to think completely different about the project. We're not making toasters, we're making a website. Toasters don't even function as it. But if, again, you're like, but if it was, what would you do, right? And then that little spark of like changing your perception about something allows you to change the way you think about it, and then you can go back to it. And so whether you're trying to solve you're on a multi-million-dollar construction project and you're trying to figure out a problem, or you're an accounting firm and you're trying to solve something, there are questions you can develop, it's specific to your industry and your job, that will force you to think differently and just change your perspective really quickly about the thing that you're staring at. And so that's a common tool that we use, asking ourselves, questions about our work.
That's great. That is totally the right. Yeah, because that's the process also, is to, when you get stuck, okay, those are the questions that you have something to go to, as opposed to just stare blankly. And interesting, going back to your point of like, when you were starting, or you had that idea of like, well, why do I need processes? Everybody can figure it out. I think that is a liability to the company, because yes, maybe you get 5 people in the room that everybody can figure it out, but I think that's part of the problem, is the lack of consistency, right? Because what if everybody figures it out in a different way, and then of course profitability, because they can spend 2-3 hours figuring it out, but you can actually, somebody figured it out and all they need to do is follow it. Right?
It's almost like you've looked into our history as an organization. Yeah, that's what we ran into, is we have to look for a specific type of person. Are those within budget? How many people can we actually find? And then you still have to train them to some concept of who you are as a brand and how you deliver work, regardless of what industry you're in, right? Like this is the, again, if we're a construction company, this is how we approach our projects or estimation or whatever it is, or your IT company, it's always different. And so, you then get stuck, right? People are owning projects differently than other people, like you said. Then what happens when one of your clients, if you're a professional service, jumps from one account manager, one consultant, or one strategist, or one accountant to somebody else, and they have a completely different way, right? And so the customer experience then changes drastically.
Well, that's another reason why to document, right? There is the customer is how should we say it? It's basically a uniform customer experience, right? Yep. And it's also controllable because then you can control the client experience, because if they move from one account manager to another, they can still have that uniform customer experience. I love that. That's definitely resonates for sure. And, you documented the processes internally. That's what we do as a company. We go into companies and we document their processes and procedures, right? But from your perspective of somebody that did it themselves by themselves in your own company, what would be the advice that you will give a business owner? Like, how did you manage to actually get it done?
Yeah, so this is the hard part, and it's great that your company gives the freedom. We had to make time for it. Right. The pain, I forgot the phrase, people don't change until the pain to stay the same is greater than the pain to change. And so we were at that point, right, where if we didn't document this, it was going to be more painful. Right. And so we carved out dedicated time. And what we started doing after that process is doing standardized retrospectives and documenting things that need to change in our process during those retros. And then we have designated people who then go back and change the process based on all the documentation. And then we review that documentation before any kickoff of a project or a phase of a project that documentation pertains to. So we now have a feedback loop, which I think is important too, because processes will change over time and they need to. And so it's not a set it and forget it thing. But if you're starting out and you don't have the resources and you need to figure out how to do it in-house, you have to carve out time. And so for us, we dedicated, I think, 2 days just on our logo design process for the first iteration. And then every month we probably had another day where we would review that until it got to the point where it was actually workable. And then the great thing about, especially if you're a professional services company, is once you've documented those the processes and systems, they can become your differentiation. So if they're unique, for us, we sell our process. Like, we're unique. We're the only agency that I know of that does it this way. And not every client likes that. But a lot of clients in our space do, because they have limited time and limited resources, and they love it. And so they now they're buying our process and our system and how we approach our work instead of just the end results, right? So we're no longer a commodity. We're a thought leader.
Absolutely. And it's also something more tangible. So it also makes you more sellable in terms of the business more, because there is a process behind it and it can be replicated and it can be basically used over and over.
Right.
Absolutely. But I definitely resonate with what you said in terms of like putting the time, but I really like what you said in terms of the feedback loop, because processes are only as good as you can actually implement them, and you actually implemented and followed by all, right, Mark?
Yeah.
So, but one of the things, like we recommend to our clients is have like a regular review of the processes, right? But what you are adding is basically that feedback loop of when you are done with the project, and sit down and basically evaluate what went right, what went wrong, and if something went wrong or incorrect, what processes can we implement in order for that are missing, and then go back and document it, right? So that is like, instead of waiting for a specific time to review it, it's like doing it like more right away, which
as close to real time as possible, right?
Close to real time as possible.
Every 2 weeks we have a retro meeting where we go through recently completed projects, and we do make all those comments. What processes do we need to implement? What processes do we need to change? Which ones?
How long does it take
you
to do that meeting?
Well, we do it pretty quickly. It's probably 45 minutes, but it really needs to be 90 minutes. So we need to work on that. We need to develop a process for our process feedback loop. And so it's a little bit meta right there, but and so
no, I love it. I mean, I love that thing that you have. It's basically like a process for the process feedback loop, but it's a process feedback loop where you actually sit down every couple of weeks and you go over. It can apply to anything. It can apply to for you, like a creative agency. So you go over all the projects that just ended, not necessarily ended, but all the projects that all the clients that got serviced in the last, like, let's say you do it every 2 weeks, right? So in the last couple of weeks, and what processes need to be, are the processes working, what needs to be improved. It can happen to any professional service company. It can happen in construction. You can do it in, home improvement services, whatever it is, because you always...
In construction, because we've worked with a handful of really large construction companies, is doing them at different stages, right? So in some cases, because a project can go on for years, right? You don't want to wait until the project closes. So depending on the industry, right, you can implement it in different ways. It could be phase one. After every phase one, we're going to do a retro to make sure estimation or whatever it is. And so whatever your industry is, think about those big milestones where if you were to perfect, phase one or milestone one, how much more time and money would it save you and give freedom back to your employees? And so if you're like, oh, well, that would be a huge win for us. Well, then add a feedback loop there where we can look at the process and see if it worked.
And ask your question, right?
Why can't we just blank? Why can't
we
just
blank? Yeah. I mean, I think that the process feedback loop together with asking the question and digging in and asking, and getting the why behind things, and like, why can we just do blank, which is a continuous improvement methodology or system, right? Because you're always looking. So with the process loop, with the process feedback loop, you're continually looking how to improve. Asking that question just gets things, people thinking about how they can improve, and together it makes a great combination and basically a recipe for success.
Yeah, for sure. And so it's been great for us, and we learned that process actually from Formula One. I'm a Formula One fan, so if any racing fans out there. And what was really remarkable is that the race is 90 minutes. They'll spend 3 to 5 hours debriefing the race because they have to make anywhere from 700 to 1,000 changes to the car before the next race to improve it, right? Because they have to stay competitive, because the competition is going to be making those changes. And so it was really interesting. They spend more time reviewing the systems, the process, what worked, what didn't work, how do we fix this, what needs to be implemented, than the actual races, right? They spend way more time on that than what the actual outcome is. And it makes the outcome better every time. And so we kind of adopted that thinking and trying to spend more time on the process in the feedback loop than in some cases the time it takes to do the task.
Amazing. Wow, what a great story and what a great advice. Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure having you here, and it's great conversation about processes. Before we end off, we have to give a shout out to John Corcoran, who introduced us. So John from Rise 25 is the co-founder together with Dr. Jeremy Wise of Rise 25, and they are the ones who are producing this podcast and have been for the last couple of years, doing a fantastic job. So big shout out to Rise 25 and John and Jeremy. And with that, thank you again, Mark. It was a pleasure having you. You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to the System Simplified podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.